The views, information, opinions expressed during the show are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Voices, the individual's employers, organization, committee, or other group or individuals. This is Voices, a space where we get to bravely share our truth, stories, experiences, and art. A ton of dope people who will motivate you, make you cry, make you laugh, bring some hope into your life, but just maybe they'll share something interesting enough to help you find your voice. Welcome to Voices. Hey guys, welcome to Voices. Today I am joined with Eduardo, also known as Eddie. He is a local community program director, a house music enthusiast, and somebody who was willing to have a difficult conversation with me. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, gracias. It's a pleasure.
Hola, Eduardo, aka Eddie. Okay, so this episode of Voices is a little bit unique. Typically I interview guests, and I can interview you about house music and all this stuff, but today we're flipping the script on me. The focus of this episode is on why we rebranded Voices, and part of rebranding Voices without using the word marginalized was because of a conversation I had with you, Eddie. So you were brave enough to be like, I don't like that word. So go ahead and walk me through that. Let's go back to like that moment.
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, you were actually filming something for our organization. And it just so happened everything was wrapped up and you were all downstairs talking and I was down there, and I just overheard the conversation about the program Voices and what you were doing. And in fact, though, I think that conversation started with the use of people of color. And I'll get to that in just a second because I have some qualms about that term. But so you're all there talking about it, and so I kind of was like, oh, this is interesting. Let me listen in. Let me see what happens. And then from there, the space kind of opened up, and someone said marginalized. And I think that's when I chimed in. And I've heard the word marginalized, since I was in undergrad. I studied sociology, so we did a lot on race and gender, and it was a common term, and you use it. But as I've grown older, and I think I've had to, just take care of life and move through it, part of the reason I've come to feel differently about the word is because you have to have such a level of agency within yourself, so whether you want to call it self-esteem, confidence, a sense of boldness to make your way in this experience. And so I know personally I would never want to be called marginalized because I feel for me that takes away my self-agency of going out, exploring, and writing my life, if you will. And so that's why I'm not big on the word, and I may have lesser circumstance, but that does not mean I myself am marginalized. I'm not a marginalized being. I may be disadvantaged economically, or what, however you want to phrase that. But that's why I have less of a like for the word marginalized. So I hope that made sense. Let me ask you this question. What did you feel about what I said then? What has your thinking has been since that moment? Has evolved? Have new questions come in? And interestingly enough, I think in that moment you mentioned your mother and how she kind of feels the same way about that word. And where does that perspective come from?
Okay, that was two questions, but let's go into it. So I think the first question, how did my perspective change? So at that time, Voices came out of a response to what was happening in society. Mm-hmm. I felt like no one was hearing the stories I felt like there was a power struggle. Mm-hmm. I felt like there were a lot of stories that were told for those that were in power, but I felt like those that lacked majority their voices weren't being heard. And so Voices really came out of a place to help, and I'm sure you're gonna talk about this, people of color or other voices that are not typically heard. But what happened was I was trying to get sponsors because I don't believe in having people's voices but not giving them like financial backing. Sure. Part of power is your voice, but also investment. And I believe in what you're doing, so I'm going to invest in what you're doing, whether it's financially or marketing or whatever. So when I was in spaces that were predominantly white, I was trying to describe my bodies of people that look like me. And so how do you say that? And I think the term that I landed on was marginalized. It's like the minute you say that in a room of people, it was like, oh, we get it. Like, we would love to give money to that body of people.
To black and brown people.
Right.
Poor black and brown.
And at the time too, my background is in television news. And I remember Googling, what is the best way, synonyms, right? Truly, I remember Googling synonyms and being like, okay, from my understanding, marginalized means a body of people that have less power. And I was like, that's really what I'm trying to represent. But when you had mentioned it, I was like, interesting. The only other person that had, because I had ran it through a lot of people, they had heard the introductions, they had seen the proposals, and no one had said anything. Yeah. And people of different, multi-generational, multi-ethnic, different ages, different groups of people. And so then when my mom was like, I just don't like that word, it wasn't a sit-down conversation. It was just like, I just don't like that word. And it was passive, very in passing. And then when you brought it up, I was like, interesting. Give me better insight as to why that is. And you're Hispanic, Latino. I'm Hispanic, Latina. And so is my mom. So I was like, is it that? Because I had some black people on my team that were like, I don't know, I feel like it's fine. It's a word that is fine. Mm-hmm. And then it was you and then Oze who challenged me. And so that was a part of my process. I think you were, so my mom was maybe a seed, right. But I just didn't think passive. About it. It was passive, it was the first time I heard it. Right. Then you said something and I was like, interesting.
Right. We got some synchronicity going on.
Okay, she's not the only one. And then when Oze had to sit down, a Zoom conversation with me. When Oze talked to me about it, I was like, we are pausing voices. And I just was like, we're gonna pause on it for a little bit. And I had to regroup and have a better understanding. Because the truth is, even at that point, even though we had 3 conversations, I had some level of understanding, but I would argue I still don't have all of the understanding. But it was enough for me to go okay, my goal is to empower, but there's a mismark with my language, and language matters. And so, yeah, I think my views have changed since then. It's still evolving, and even these episodes, I'm uncomfortable because I'm like, there's gonna be questions or ignorance, but then I'm like, this is what we do for the other shows. I don't understand what it's like to be transgender. I don't understand some of the conversations I'm having with other people. And so I'm willing to go first because part of growing is messing up and saying, I'm humble enough to go yo, I messed up. Hopefully by seeing that I messed up, you can mess up too. And
right. So it's a couple thoughts, but before we get to that, so Oze sounds like has an influential place in your life.
100%.
So who is he, and where is he coming from, and what's his context or worldview that had him land on that position?
So he'll be coming. We're doing a separate interview with him. Okay, we're doing a separate interview with him. So it'll be, that's why. So both of you guys are two different people who had these difficult conversations with me.
And I would say I don't think it's been difficult at all. I've been rather comfortable. I don't know how it is on your end. But I'm great. I think what's one of the things as I've grown older and become much more independent in how I think about the world is one of the difficulties that I've just really started to reconcile is I don't think I fall squarely into one camp, right? And so there's things that I have a conservative standpoint because of my experience and what I study and what I see, and there's other stuff that I'm really liberal. It just depends on what it is. So I can never say I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican or da-da-da. I think what I do is, okay, well, what's the science? What do we know about the science? What are people telling us? What are their lived experiences? What's my experience? And come to the best judgment I can make on any one given situation, independent whether that aligns with my identity or not. I'm just trying to go for what I think is rationally the smartest position I can take as far as my understanding. Yeah. And the reason I bring that up is because I think what's happening today, to make it simply, people say the whole cancel culture thing. And yeah, that's part of it, but I do think there is a lack of grace and patience that we have with each other when people use a term that's maybe outdated, or, you know, or you didn't say it the right way, or you fucked up my pronoun or whatever. It's like, okay, I'm sorry. Like, I don't know, like, tell me, like, you know, like, no one knows it all. And I think part of the assignment when we sign up to be humans is that, hey, you're going to fall, you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to constantly have to transform yourself, as they say in the academy, unlearn and relearn, right? Yeah. So I think a lot of that is lost in today, and makes now everything is a difficult conversation, which maybe it's not difficult, but it's just somber, serious, and just really frank and direct. And like, how are we understanding each other as beings and individual? I think that art is lost a lot.
You're hitting on a point of how this show even became, like how it got created. The founding thoughts behind creating it is that I lived and knew, how do I say this? I lived with and knew a lot of families that had very differing views than my friends. So it's like peers and mentors were having completely different experiences and different conversations, especially during the tension and political and racial like divide that we were at as a country. And so it was weird because I was like, I want to be a bridge. I feel like I'm in the middle. There's some perspectives I understand. There's some perspectives I don't understand, but I wish I could just have people sit at the same table. But I was like, I think the step one of sitting at the same table and having an understanding of one another's perspective is people being willing to share their voice. And then what was interesting, and I talked to you about this, my goal was like, okay, I feel like there's a voice that's being missed. Let's do a show that shows like those artists, those people in my life who I feel like have valid points, have valid experiences, because at this point, there were things that were said that were like, racism doesn't exist. And even as I say it, I get like, no, that's not true. Like, racism does exist, but because of lack of proximity, there's a lack of understanding. And so for me, I was like, well, maybe so when we started, it was like, no, like racism does exist. But then it evolved into there's other things that exist that maybe people don't have proximity to. So I was like, if I do a show that maybe, and I'm just gonna generalize for now. I don't want people getting mad, but this is just a part of it. That maybe someone that's uncommon in their experience. So we'll say in a white experience, it's uncommon to hear from a Hispanic, Black, Asian, Native American experience. Middle Eastern experience, like if you don't hear from those experiences, then of course you're in your bubble of what your experience is. So I think I created a show where I was like, okay, I want to bring something to the table for those who lack proximity and educate. But then that's where the confusion came. I was like, but then I can't say the show is only for like Black and brown folks and people who look like me and not like you, because the truth is I built it where I was like, I really want white people, those who maybe lack awareness, those that maybe lack proximity, to now have something in their bubble to maybe challenge a thought. And then I was like, maybe long term we can sit both parties at the same table, right? And you and I talked about that because I was like, this is the way to be the bridge. And
I think I blew that shit up in the water. I know, yeah.
You were one of the people that were like, just stop. Just stop trying to speak to a different body of people. The people that are actually watching your show are those that care about what you're talking about. And I think for me, I'm going to be honest, I was like, nah, I disagree. Like, because at the time, but this was the blessing, at the time there were white couples that were seeing it and saying that changed my perspective. There were people, I'm going to say in the big C church, right, who maybe had more conservative views, watching and having changed views, and it was sparking really difficult but crucial conversations. So I was like, oh my goodness, it's hitting the mark. Yeah. But then when I got the flack from my own community, it was really humbling, but also like, I felt sad, but I also felt like kind of frustrated because I was like, that wasn't my intention, but impact, I know the impact. And I'm like, this was the opposite of my objective. My objective wasn't to, even that I had a conversation with somebody who was like, are you tokenizing? And I was like, no, like not at all. That's actually like the opposite of what I wanted, which is why I even went to try to get funding, to try to invest. And, but I could see how the language put us in boxes. And even the way it was designed, I could just see the impact instead of the intention. Like there was a disconnect between intention and impact. And so we paused for a second. I took it really seriously. I like rewrote things 1,000 times. The team can vouch. I was like, this is what I'm gonna say. We should do a video like this. And Oze was like, why don't you just share like truthfully how you even arrived at that word? Because that was his key thing. He asked really pivotal questions like, why the word marginalized? How did you arrive there? And he's like, interesting, you arrive there in circles where that's a language that makes them feel comfortable. And I think for me, being honest, I felt comfortable with the word marginalized because I worked in news. That is the word. And even when you watch the news, it is the word that is used to represent the full body of people. It's not just black and brown, it's women, it's, but then it's like in some circles, it has an economic description, and then in some circles it has a skin color description. And so, yeah, let's talk about language and why is marginalized not the right term for somebody that's watching this. It's like, I think this doesn't even matter. What would you say to them? And then let's talk about alternative languages, alternative words that would work better.
Right. So, I threw out a couple phrases earlier. I think work, socially disadvantaged or economically disadvantaged. I think part of it too is wrapped up in my belief about the metaphysics of our experience, right? So I do believe, however cliche or corny, this idea of there's a force that permeates everything, and that is what binds us all together, right? It's that thing that can't be named, that we all feel, that we all know, that's inside of us and everything. We can't name it, but we know it, right? So because I have a belief in that idea, and I believe that my connection to that is what liberates me from the physical trappings of a world, I don't ever think I'll come to believe that I, as a spiritual being, am ever going to be marginalized or oppressed. I maybe be discriminated against, right? Be at on the receiving end of discrimination, or oppressive tactics, if you will. But I myself, as a being, am never going to be oppressed, never going to be marginalized as a being, because my spirit is always free, independent of my circumstance.
Fascinating.
So, but that's a very specific, belief or structure, worldview. But again, that's a very specific mindset that I don't know how many share. That's where my take on all this comes from, and it's very difficult to reiterate among my colleagues because it's not really shared, or I often think that people take on religion and spirituality as a hobby and a side hustle, right? Like when shit goes down, then that's okay. Let's go to that, or like, okay, now's the time. Now that things are really grave, and But when you're in a disagreement with your partner or a friend or whatever, you're just letting out emotions and everything, versus saying, you know what, I am going to live from a more mystical place. I am going to stay in my own alignment. I am going to take responsibility for my emotions and my response or reaction to everything. I am going to own 100% of what's on my plate in my worldview. Even though other people make it more difficult, I'm never going to blame anyone. I'm always going to figure it out and sort it out and figure out what it is it's all about. That's a very committed stance I don't think most people take, or at least I haven't seen take. And so as a result, when we get in these conversations of power, privilege, marginalized, whatnot, to say that, hey, there's a greater force, and it's like, okay, get the fuck out of here. go smoke a J and like leave us alone, right? Like, because you're seen as this woo-woo type of crystals and energy and, you know, like whatever, frequency bowls and that whole thing. I think sometimes you're couched in that, but I do believe that there is a presence of force that supersedes everything. And that is what kind of drives my analysis to that and everything else.
So do you think that the reason why I want to make sure I'm understanding correctly and repeating back correctly, but so if I'm hearing correctly, you don't like the label, don't even want to associate it with it because you're like, I'm not that. And who I am as a being is more of like a spirit being, spiritual being. And so the constructs that you're putting based on society, world standards, is that correct, is not applicable.
Yeah, I think if I make any adjustment, I would say I don't think I denounce it or anything or resist it. If someone wants to describe me marginalized, okay, that's the way you're describing me or how you want to position me. But I have my own way, my own position, my own way of thinking of what or who I am. So it's like, all right, whatever, I'm on something else.
That's fascinating. I like it and own it. But clearly was there just enough trust that you were just like, I don't like that word?
Trust in this idea.
Is that why? Because I'm looking back at that moment. Because you're like, if somebody calls me that, whatever. But when we talked about it.
I think that's just a general extension of me always wanting to share my opinion. Because I don't believe I'm smart and have something to add, so.
Whatever. Aren't you like studying right now? So talk to me about your PhD. So you're doing your doctorate in sociology.
What we call teacher education.
Teacher education.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So teacher education is we study essentially what we have to do to prepare students who want to become teachers. Right.
Yeah.
So if there's medical school, think of us as teacher school.
Got it. I love it. And isn't your dissertation or final paper? Tell me what that is about. Yeah.
So I focus on resistance. So the first question was like, well, what the fuck? What do you mean by resistance? Right? What is that? And so I've essentially, for my work, I find 3 types of resistance. Resistance in terms of a political act, like I'm going out to protest. Resistance from a place of fear and anger, right? You're pushing against what you don't like, or the unwanted discomfort, the pain. And instead of trying to figure it out, you're really focused on what you don't want, and you're just clamoring on that and keep protesting against that. And usually, a lot of times that's from fear or anger, that sort of thing, or bigotry or prejudice. You don't want to change. You don't want things to change, and so you're resisting. So that's what I call defensive resistance, right? And then there's the other kind of resistance, which I call this transformative. It's that little bit of pushback you get when you're working, when you're in labor, when you're moving, when you're, running a marathon, right? That physical discomfort that you experience of kind of stretching yourself, if you will, or more commonly, when you're out of your comfort zone, as they say, that's where you grow. So those are the 3 types of resistance. But the reason how I came to this is that a lot of teacher education programs require students to take what is called the Social Foundations course, or critical multicultural ed course. And in these courses, you talk about religion, sex, gender, race, class, the thing, all of it. But as you might imagine, when race comes up, all hell breaks loose. Keep in mind, 85% of the teacher workforce is female and white and middle class. And most of those teachers actually want to go back to the community they came from to teach. So a lot of them don't want to be in communities unlike their own.
Wow, I didn't know that stat.
Yeah. So, and many of them come in with, this idea of proximity, have very limited experience with people unlike their own race or culture. Some do, but most of them don't. It's whatever they see on TV or whatever they find out. So the belief systems are all kinds. So then you come in and you're going to talk about race. One, that racism exists in the US. That for some is like, what are you talking about? Like, no way. Then we can talk about the myth of meritocracy, that some people that the system isn't fair, that it isn't based on merit, that it's actually based on who has access to what resources and supports, and that's what gets you in the door and connections, right? So in that conversation about race, the students and the instructor tend to blow up and they fight with each other. There's a lot of conflict. The student is resistant defensively, it's being defensive about what's being taught. And the instructor is being defensive because the student's being defensive, if that makes sense. And so my work is to share my analysis of what resistance means. Hey, don't take it personal. They're just being fearful right now because you're just throwing something that's going to change their complete worldview.
Interesting.
It's going to make them rethink their relationships, the jokes they say at the bar, who they're associating with. Like, think about it. Like, if you change a certain racial perspective, you're going to have to reconsider a lot of your social life and the way you go about things and your attire and right, like all kinds of stuff. And so there's pushback from the students, and then the instructor's frustrated because they feel like they want them to believe this and this is important in the name of justice. And so then they get into the argument with the student. But the problem is it's unproductive. And so my work is to, one, say, hey, when you see that resistance from the student, one, don't take it personally. And two, it's really that they're scared and they're angry and they don't know how to handle this. And they're emotionally immature and are reacting versus responding. Right? We've all been there. Or at least I have. Let me not put my experience on others. So my work is looking at that, talking to the instructor, seeing how they're looking at it, because it needs to change. Once the relationship with the student and the teacher's adversarial, the learning stops, the growth stops. So I talk to the instructors, see their view. I look at the literature. I look at psychoanalysis, what that says about resistance. Someone described it like this when Martha, I'm forgetting on her last name, psychoanalyst, but she says the difficulty with change is that imagine you're in hell and everything's burning. And I tell you, okay, you can get out of hell, the ladder's over there, but the ladder's on fire. So you have to go up through the ladder that's on fire and go through that pain to get out of hell. So what happens is most people just stay in hell. So it's kind of like they'd rather be in comfort in the unknown than face the discomfort of the unknown, even though the unknown is where the release, the next, how would I say? Yeah. Let me explain it even better. Have you ever met someone who stays in a relationship that they know is not healthy and they should not be there? Why do they do it? Because they don't want to face the discomfort of leaving and having to have new questions to answer and figure it out and go through that whole emotional, what they call the river of change. So instead of going through that, I'd rather just stay comfortable and almost be ignorant or whatever.
Do you think that's what happened in society after George Floyd? There's evidence in the face of society to go, maybe your worldview should change.
Yeah, I mean, I remember what was surprising me about that was learning that Rush Limbaugh, right, big conservative, I think he's passed away now, but at that time, big conservative guy, Trump supporter, Bush, and he ended up calling the Breakfast Club, the show, New York radio show, I think it was the next day, to express his sympathy and say, I feel for you guys, that was wrong. And so I think it was that moment, but all the other moments that preceded George Floyd. And I think, it was the moment of, if you're gonna leave the racist camp, this is your opportunity. Like, this is the last boat on this.
Because there's already been so many experiences.
It's wide open now. This is it. And it was like that moment where everybody's like, okay, let's latch on. All the corporations latched on because they knew it was like, this is the wave to catch.
Which I don't even know if I agree with that. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation as a business owner, because I think then at that point it's like, are you in a PR movement or do you care? Right.
But to the point, or give evidence to the fact that, all right, this was the wave to take. To say, if you're not racist, this is an easy one to stand for. right? Because everybody's behind it. So, and and to this day, I think a lot of the racial justice stuff that we see is just fashion.
Is fashion.
Yeah.
Oh, you don't hear that every day.
Yeah. They'll all be putting Black Lives Matter on everybody, on your social media handle and all that. I'm not saying categorically, but there's a lot of fashion around social justice and racial justice.
Fascinating.
It's easy to wear, easy to throw up, but do you really understand the issues? Like, who are you as a person, your character? And when shit hits the fan, are you worth your salt? But like, it's kind of like, I purposely, so in that moment, in that summer, well, I don't know if you remember, there was a day that nobody was supposed to post on Instagram, right? It was the day, it was a blackout. Right? Everybody was gonna post a black square. Right? And Black Solidarity. So I did the opposite. I purposely posted, and I was like, fuck that. Me not posting on Instagram ain't gonna do shit. You guys think that this is like, for me, my view is
somebody's like, offended right now.
Yeah, and it's like, to think this is meaningful or like significant, like I wasn't seeing it. And so I posted, and when I posted ideas of how we can reform things or things we can do. Right, the chokeholds, getting rid of those, how we train police, how much training you get. So I listed my things that needed to happen, but fuck off, I'm not gonna shut up. Like, and put a black square and think I've done my duty in this? Get out of here. Like, for me, I found it as a very infantile and maybe not immature, but adolescent take on a real fucking issue. And not posting, not my cup of tea.
Yeah. Well,
I got that across.
You work in the community, so you're also somebody who is in action oriented. So that makes sense to me.
Yeah, and action, but I think it has to be deliberate, intentional, meaningful. Maybe a better word. Heartfelt. Right?
Sincere.
Yeah.
And I think you're hitting on something, though. I think that's heart changes, but heart changes take time, right? And even this moment, right? This is super small to change the word marginalized, but it was about the heart to go, let's pause. This is the opposite of fashionable. That was not the heart.
Yeah.
Let's make a change. So to wrap this up, what other questions do you have for me as I'm on the hot seat?
All right, so given all the conversations you've had, where are you now? As best you can define. Certain things you may not be able to find, certain parameters, but what can you define?
So where I stand now, I think that's a really good question. I think that's tough. I think I'm still learning. The things I know, right? The things I know is that anytime there's something we do that offends, hurts, or furthers any form of oppression, something needs to change. I know that putting language that categorizes people instead of maybe celebrating, so using language that celebrates, is not the best way. And what I mean by that is what I learned is that, okay, whether I learned in school that marginalized is societally acceptable, or whether my worldview communicated that this was okay, if people love me enough to tell me that it's not okay, I have to be humble enough to slow it down and go, okay, my worldview needs to change. And so things I've changed is that I just don't describe people as marginalized anymore. And I think twice anytime I'm speaking in categories. But so even now, as I was explaining, I was sitting in a room with many white people, that felt challenging still because it's still categorizing white people. And so I feel challenged to find other language that doesn't involve categorizing people. And how can I use language that helps celebrate? And so we changed from marginalized to hey, this is just a show where we show dope people sharing their work, because it's not just about, people's identity is not based on what category they fit in, but it's based on who they are as a being, not what they are, just not categories. And so there's still, I think, a lot I don't know. And I think I'm in a process of like changing my worldviews because I've sat in so many different circles. But I think the awareness to go, yo, if people who care about you said like, that's not the best, finding alternatives. And so where have I landed with the word marginalized? I don't think it's a great way to describe a big body of group of people. I think it's funny, you're the one that had said this to me a long time ago. You said like, you think people of color is a lazy term.
Oh, fuck yeah.
I think that
I can go for half an hour on that.
It's funny, when you first said it, I was like, I disagree. But I think the truth is I actually agree because there's so many different cultures and so many different, you have different countries where people are from, different languages. And it's the same way that as a Hispanic person, if somebody's like, everybody's Mexican, it's like, well, I'm actually Mexican and Puerto Rican. It's not that that's my identity, but that is still a part of me. And if we silence one part of me, that's inaccurate. And so I think for me, it's like using the term marginalized as inaccurate. It's actually not helpful. My goal is to be empowering. And if it's not empowering, then it's getting cut. And I still have to catch myself sometimes because that was a part of my normal worldview. So I would say that's where I'm at and still in development. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, no. And I hope that's what everybody takes, is that this thing doesn't end.
Yeah.
Right? This evolvement, like the way my mother thinks about the world today is not what she thought about 10 years ago when the way she raised me. Mm-hmm. Same with my father. And I imagine if we were to talk here again 10, 15 years, we would have had different experiences, mm-hmm. and we're going to think about different things and new lenses. And I think that's the way it should be, infinitely transforming our view and our perspective. I just don't think we give room to that today, and everybody wants to get an identity, throw up the flag, and fight something. And I always think about the saying, the truth is usually in the middle. Well, it kind of keeps me
grounded. Well, then we'll end it on that. The truth usually in the middle. Thank you, Eddie, for being on this episode. Eduardo, aka Eddie, can find you online. Yeah. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you for having me. It's fun.
This episode of Voices has been brought to you by Blue Owl Coffee and Vision Success Marketing and Consulting.